I have some really interesting thoughts to share today because I think we read the New Testament wrong. I think we read the New Testament thinking that the Apostle Paul wrote his books after the Gospels were written, and that's not what actually happened. So when we look at what the Apostle Paul actually said, we find some interesting stuff. It seems like to me that the Apostle Paul was preaching a different gospel than that of the gospel writers, and I want to explore that for a little bit today. So we all know that there's 27 books in the New Testament, right? Starts with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then we get Acts, we get the letters of Paul, and then we get more letters from other writers, which is then followed by the book of Revelation. So when we look at those 27 letters, the easy tendency for Christians, especially those who haven't looked at the scholarship, is to think that they were written in that order. First the Gospels were written, and then Paul's letters were written. But we actually know that Paul's letters were written first. So you see, Jesus died sometime between 30 and 33 AD. Scholars are debating on those dates, but it's either 30 or 33 AD. Great. We don't get any writings, none of the New Testament writings, until at least 20 years later, when Paul was writing his letters around 50 AD, and shortly thereafter. And the first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, wasn't written until at least 65 to 70 AD. So we actually have a 20-year gap from the time that Paul started his writings to when the first gospel is written. And by the time the gospels are done, that was another 30 years. Another 30 years. So Mark was written between 65 and 70, but it took 30 more years for the rest of the Gospels to actually be written. So I think it's actually important for Christians to think about reading the New Testament chronologically. Let's look at when these books were actually written, and then we'll read the New Testament differently. Because there are some key differences between the message that Paul had and the message that Jesus had in the Gospels. Let's think about that for a second, right? How does someone actually get saved? Salvation. This is the most important message of the New Testament, right? Because things change completely. How does somebody actually get saved? Well, 20 years after Jesus died, Paul was stating that the way to salvation is by grace through faith alone. No works involved. For by grace are you saved through faith, right? That's Ephesians 2 verse 8. So that is how someone is supposed to be saved, according to Paul's theology, Paul's doctrine. So isn't it weird when we look back at what Jesus actually said? When the Gospel of Matthew, which was written between 80 and 85 CE, so 35 years after Paul's writings, Matthew was written, and they're recording Jesus saying that he is not here to do away with the law, he's here to fulfill the law. So when he fulfills the law, he then goes forward and says that in order to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you have to keep the law. As a matter of fact, he talks about the Pharisees, those who pay the most attention to the law. And he says if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you have to keep the law better than the Pharisees do. Better than the Pharisees. So that's a very different salvation message to enter the kingdom of heaven. In the book of Matthew, 30 years after Paul, Jesus is saying, you have to keep the law. You have to keep the law. And Paul's saying, you don't have to keep the law. Those are two very different salvation messages. Very different. And I know that this was a controversy that was going on in the church during that time. Because Paul talks about in Galatians that he was having issues with Peter and with James. Now, what were those issues about? Well, with James specifically, we know what that issue was about. James had an issue with Paul's take on salvation, being by grace alone. How do we know this? Let's look at what James says in James chapter 2. He talks about how you need to have salvation by your works, not faith alone. That is a direct rebuke of the Apostle Paul in his letter into the Ephesians that said you do not have to do works to have salvation. And James says, yeah, No, you do. You have to have some works to go along with it. And so there is actual real disagreement between the New Testament when you look at how are people supposed to find salvation. I think that's an important factor to point out because it's easy to say, oh, okay, well, those were the Gospels. That's the message that was being presented, in Jesus' time. And then, of course, Paul has this new revelation to get rid of the law, and that's why the message is now changed. But that's not how the storyline actually plays out if you look at the Gospels chronologically. If you look chronologically, shortly after Jesus' death, Paul came up with this message of salvation by grace through faith alone. And yet, 30 years later, the church, the Jewish believers, had switched that message and said, no, that was never the intention. The intention was always for there to be a change and for salvation by faith to be a part of it, but works were still involved. And we see that evidence in Matthew, we see that evidence in James, and then it makes a lot more sense in Galatians chapter 2 when we find out that Paul has major issues with Peter and James, and they have major issues with him. Now, I do not trust the story that I read in the book of Acts about this Jerusalem council. This council where Paul meets up with Peter and James and they work through their issues. I cannot believe the story that I'm being told there. Why? Again, when did Paul write Galatians? Sometime between 50 and 60 CE, right? But the book of Acts was penned after the book of Luke by the same author who wrote the book of Luke. And so that we know was going to be at least 30 or 35 years later. And it makes sense why they may have wanted to smooth over those accounts. But in Galatians we find, which again was written between 50 and 60 CE, that Paul had major issues with Peter and major issues with James. And we don't see that those were fully resolved. But in the book of Acts, when we look at that same council in Jerusalem, we see a different story where there's not really a lot of animosity there. They're able to resolve their problems and move on. But that's not what Paul said happened. And so when we look chronologically, I think it's easy to understand. The author of Acts was trying to smooth things over, a disagreement that Paul had mentioned years earlier. And he wanted to smooth that over, and he was motivated to say that, no, that's not actually what happened. We are one unified church. We're unified in terms of salvation. We're unified in terms of what's clean and unclean. But that's a story that he told later. Paul's messages came first. And so to me, when I read the Gospels, when I read the New Testament, I'm trying to put things into their real context. And part of context is understanding who wrote it and when did they write it. And that should change how we actually read these things. And so I just want you to think about that today, because it's possible that the Apostle Paul had a different gospel than that of the rest of the apostles. And Paul actually mentions this when he says, beware of those who come with another gospel. He talks about Christians who so easily accept another gospel than his gospel. So even Paul thought that. But I think we've always assumed that those must be some kind of pagan gospels or something else. There's a possibility here that Paul never reconciled with Peter and with James, and he saw them as the other gospel. Now, what would that mean for the salvation message? And why do we see different salvation messages between Paul and Jesus if these are supposed to line up? I think these are big questions. I'm going to be looking more into this. I want you to do your own research on it as well. But let me know your thoughts so far. Drop some notes into the comments. Let me know what you think about this. Have you ever considered how the chronology of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament might actually impact the message that's there and how we read it? This is a different kind of episode for us, so if you're enjoying it, if you like having a conversation out here while I'm walking through the woods, let me know. I'm happy to do more of these, just giving some of my raw thoughts, where most of my content is going to be a lot more focused on issues that I have fully researched. I'll have the Bible in front of me, I'll share the scripture, but sometimes it's just nice to come out here and walk and totally get your thoughts out there. So looking forward to your feedback on that. It's been another episode of Faith in Question. I'll see you next time.